counselor at Southeast Psych. I generally work primarily with teenage and young adult males. That's kind of my area of specialty. I work anything or in areas anywhere regarding mental health to ADHD and just sort of life challenges. And then one of the areas that a lot of times people refer to me is when there's any addictive type of problems, whether it be with drugs or alcohol or technology, anything along those lines. Wanted to briefly talk about two programs I'm involved in, just so you guys are aware of. One is called Purposeful Parenting, and it's very much a practical skills-based program that we have a number of clinicians that have teamed together to really address and develop a program from early age all the way up to college age and young adults, and kind of some of the skills that parents would benefit from as your kids transition in each of those phases. And then another program that we're involved in, I'm actually the leader of, it's called Quarter Life, and it's a new program that specifically looks at getting young guys to that age 25, 29, and some of the skill sets and tools that they'll need to be successful. We're sort of seeing in this generation a real phenomenon of quarter-life crisis with a lot of young adult guys, and so we're identifying some of the struggles and needs that they need moving forward to be successful and happy in life. So today, as we kind of talk a little bit about teenagers and just this generation of kids, and in a number of ways I'm going to try to present some current data and information, some talking points that helps us understand in some ways why this generation is a little bit unique and different as every generation is, while at the same time kind of talking about and circling back to a lot of, quite honestly, universal and timeless skills and techniques for what we generally describe as very purposeful parenting and positive parenting. And as we do this, one of the things that I always, whenever I talk to parents, is that if we just kind of take our breath and settle down for a moment, the recognition is, regardless of the generation or era that we're in, most kids go through normal development as they transition from each stage, and normal development is unpredictable and inconsistent, because even though we know the time frame of puberty and brain development and hormonal development, there's no specific sequence or timetable that happens with our kids. But regardless of that, once we step back away from sort of the immediacy of all that change, there's that recognition that most kids, the majority of our children, are going to go through normal development. It's unpredictable, it's uneven, but they're going to come out on the other side. Every adult goes through this, and we see more often than not, they come out just healthy and really have a lot of kind of foundation and tools at their disposal to live a really meaningful and happy life. One of the things we're learning, and for those of you that are parents of multiple kids, is you recognize more and more, even as we try to talk about parenting, one of the reasons if you go to a bookstore, you go on Amazon and you see every month there's like a dozen new parenting books, or once you are on the web, you see every day there's new articles about parenting. And one of the reasons for that is we're learning more and more that the greatest success you'll have with your kids is being able to parent to their unique needs. And so if we just have sort of one blanket approach to parenting and you have multiple kids, what may be very successful for one of your children, another one of your kids just does not respond to, because of kind of how they're wired, and as well as some of their strengths and some of their challenges or setbacks. And so one of the reasons we try to go to the community as much as possible and talk about parenting is to be able to recognize, A, what are your kids' unique needs and challenges, and then how do we, in a really proactive way, parent to their specific needs, versus try to do a one-size-fits-all model that oftentimes you may get 2 out of 3, or you may get 3 out of 4, but inevitably you may have a very unique and quirky kid that doesn't respond to that parenting model and philosophy. And with that, as we look through like the timetable of adolescence and teenage years, is one of the things I tend to try to communicate and just sort of, in a lot of ways, normalize to parents, is that expect resistance. Resistance is part of that normal normal stage of development, that they start to push back a little bit of parenting as they try to figure out this idea of autonomy and independence, even though your teenagers, your young kids are also learning as they go. So it's not as though they have it all figured out as well. Even if your kid struggles in certain ways and you see some behavioral problems or you see some of the things that they may be, you kind of start flagging as a parent like, oh, this is really gonna catch up to them. You know, unless your kid is seeing me or someone in my field 2 or 3 times a day or two or three times a week, we can step back and say, your kids are making responsible, positive choices every day in a lot of different areas. So again, it's always kind of stepping back and in some ways checking our own emotions and how kind of personal or revved up we can get, which I know is difficult because there's nothing more personal than family. But, so let's talk about, again, this idea of this generation. We kind of tagged it millennials or the iGeneration, but there are some unique things that we didn't really have to face growing up, or our parents didn't have to really be mindful of as they were raising us. And one of the things we recognize is there's this new stage of development. We tend to call it emerging adulthood. And what I mean by that is this. What we know is 30 years ago, puberty was starting about 18 months later than it is now. And so right now, females are starting puberty on average around age 10 and a half. And we know boys are starting it around age 11, which, like I said, is about 18 months earlier than 30 years ago. So some of the brain development, some of the hormonal, some of the frontal lobe growth, we're starting to see that earlier and earlier. So sort of that early childhood period is not lasting as long. But on the flip side, what we're also seeing is launching into adulthood is happening later. So what we know is all the markers that generally people identify as like, I've reached adulthood, completing college, getting married, having kids, being financially independent from their parents, that's happening later now. And then even when you survey this generation of, you know, do you feel like a actual full independent adult, we're seeing more and more people in their late 20s and even in their early 30s not saying, I feel like a fully independent adult. We know that 30, 40 years ago, the average age of getting married was about age 21 for girls and 23 for guys. Now that's at 25 and 27 is the average age. We know people are starting to have kids later in life, and then they're not having as many kids. And some of that's for socioeconomic reasons. There's a number of factors involved. We know that kids can go to college and get a 4-year degree and still have tremendous difficulty finding a job that they can financially support themselves. So we see kids, young adults, still on their parents' health insurance. They must all like whatever I said. They're still on their parents' health insurance. They're getting some financial assistance from their parents even later on. So what we see is we have kind of puberty and teenage years starting earlier, but we see adulthood happening later. So we have this large gap that in a lot of ways generations before us didn't have to kind of address, well, what happens during that phase? Because what we start to see is this period where they're no longer a kid, but they're not yet an adult. And how do you navigate that even as a parent? How do you kind of figure out where we get to exert that authority and where do we step back and let them be more autonomous and independent? So that's one of the unique things we know about this generation, which is why I work a lot with what we would call failure to launch young adults, to where they're having a lot of difficulty how to make the most of that extended time between when you're a child and when you're a full independent adult. And we're going to look at some of the variables and factors that also play into that. So let's take a look a little bit about how we would summarize the iGeneration, because there's really 7 big factors, or 7 big characteristics. More so than any other generation before them, they embrace technology, they are multitaskers, and they think they're great at it, but they're really not. They're always in some type of connection. They're continuously wired within a community to the point where, especially with guys, they start to pull away from actual face-to-face interaction because things like gaming, they're connecting and making friends over broadband and over the internet. This generation is actually very high achieving. Right now, in the fall of 2014 and the fall of 2015, statistics aren't yet available, but it was a record number of 18 to 24-year-olds going to college. Record number in terms of overall numbers and percentage. So this generation this generation is excelling and achieving in terms of academics and just overall kind of padding their resumes for college in a way that other generations haven't. They are very open to change. I do a lot of talks about diversity and identity formation, and we just look at how this generation more so is very tolerant and open to change, and in a lot of ways they've kind of thrown out that mindset of different is worse, different is just different. Very confident, we're going to look at that in a second. And then obviously the number one factor of this generation, which it really has been for most in terms of teenage years, is fun. Everything has to have some undercurrent of fun, or else it has to open a door for fun down the road. And so we see that with this generation. Now, when we talked a little bit about kind of that they're just technologically savvy and they're very wired, and that's really become a part of their life. I didn't get a cell phone until in my mid-20s, and I didn't get a cell phone until my wife made me get a cell phone because I hate talking on the phone. But what we know about this generation is, on average, teenagers are spending 53 hours a week in front of a screen. But remember, I talked about that multitasking component, so they actually pack in closer to 77 hours of technology on any given week, because oftentimes they'll have either a TV or a computer screen on while they're also having a smartphone or something of that nature. And so teenagers are spending about 11 hours a day. They're getting kind of technology kind of saturated. Yes?
Does that include, like for your high school kids, right? They have a laptop now.
Yeah.
Does that include those hours?
It does.
Okay.
It does. And this is constantly changing because I work a lot with teens that have, and young adults that have technology addiction problems. And that's starting to become a challenge when more and more, even at the middle or high school age level, a lot of their assignments and a lot of the ability for them to complete their schoolwork, they have to be engaged in technology. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it really kind of separates and highlights those kids that are kind of wired to more kind of addictive and obsessive behaviors that aren't able to self-regulate and pull away. Now, having said that, adults, we are actually almost just as, I don't want to say the word bad, but we are almost just as saturated with technology. The difference is that parents in older generations tend to spend more of it in terms of television and radio than necessarily computer time. But what we're seeing with this generation is they need, more so than any, boundaries and limitations. Because part of it is that technology a lot of times sends mixed messages to the body. So you get the optical stimulation and arousal, but at the same time, if they're very stationary in terms of their body, it can create this mixed message of how relaxed or how tense. I talk a lot with teen guys playing video games. They say it's the way I relax and unwind, but what they don't realize is physiologically, they're actually in a state, if they're playing video games, of hypertension, because it still is competitive, and they are very hyper-focused while at the same time stimulating their optical nerves to where a lot of times they're having difficulty falling asleep because their body gets these mixed messages. On the one hand, I'm tense. On the other, I'm stationary, I'm relaxed. But on the other hand, I'm hyper-aroused. And so our body, we're starting to see how the brain can be, conditioned in a lot of ways to not be able to automatically relax itself from a stressful situation. So we place limitations. Generally, the good rule of thumb is no more than 2 hours. And obviously, we live in a real world, where oftentimes when pediatric advocacies recommend certain things, it's very difficult as a family to do that. But we talk about limiting even the number of acts, not just hours, but just the amount of choice in itself. Anytime my daughters want a new free game on something or an app, they say, well, which one are we going to get rid of? Because as parents, if we're conditioned that we have to do some degree of supervision or monitoring, every new thing that they get, it's one more thing either I know about or I don't know about. I understand or I don't understand. I monitor or I choose not to monitor. And so that's one of the ways that we can also create boundaries and limitations. Yeah, I mean,
So I cut it back to, I think, what you probably just addressed, but that 2 hours a day, so my high schooler he's on his computer probably 3 to 4 hours a day for homework.
mm-hmm.
Is that 2 hours like their playing time, their video playing
No,
time?
it's usually in terms of recreational screen time.
So not his schoolwork?
Not schoolwork, although one of the things we know, we talked about this multitasking, is that this generation is having terrible sleep problems, which we're also seeing that this generation is an epidemic of obesity in terms of a lot of ways. And part of that is the multitasking is not as efficient. So a kid is doing their homework, but they're also going back and forth, checking social media, texting, watching Netflix, and they think they're being efficient, but they're not. If anything, they are wasting time that they would be able to be more efficient with their homework, be able to have actual quality time with the recreation, and still maybe get a little bit more sleep. And we're seeing that when they try to multitask, everything suffers and takes longer than it would be if we created more of a not so much a rigid, but a fixed kind of schedule. Yeah.
How do you approach that and consistently advise your high schooler you're being inefficient, and how can you see, because that's the problem, you're saying it's an epidemic, they're constantly on there. So
Sure.
how do you know if they're doing homework? How do you know? You don't know that, and you don't want to be on top of
You
it
don't.
because they're young adults.
Yeah,
How do you
and
approach
one of the
that
things is
situation?
if you identify, like, this is a struggle for me, and the setup is already kind of difficult, we're going to expect resistance, right? Because in some ways it feels like now we're over-parenting and taking back freedom that they already have. But one of the things, and I'm not sure if it's in this presentation or not, we have to start thinking about what is the priority as parents. What is the most important thing? For my family, one of the keys is sleep. Like, you know, more often than not, we turn down sleepovers because of the sleep. And they can never have a Saturday night sleepover because Monday they're still recovering and they're a horrible wreck. Because the 4 corners of healthy living are diet, exercise, social interaction, connection with others, and sleep. Sleep makes everything in life harder. But we also know technology flares up the stimuli to where they're going to have difficulty falling asleep. A lot of times when I work with my technology guys, they've been on technology for 4 or 5 hours and then they just try to turn off the lights and go to sleep. One of the challenges is if your teens already have a computer that they have in their room, that they do their homework in their room, it's not in terms of an entirely open area, as well as do they have their phone, do they need their phone while they're doing, and if there was an easy answer, I'd be out of a job. But the recognition is we identify this is not working for this generation. For some, it is, but those kids were going to be successful regardless of whatever generation that they fell in because they are very self-directed and self-motivated. Most other kids struggle with what I need to do, what I want to do. Yeah?
I've seen, like with my nieces and things, they just have severe memory deficits, and it's because, I don't know if it's because the answer's always there in the little box.
Mm-hmm.
For them, if they don't have to remember it, and then the lack of sleep, they don't seem to be able to retain any information that.
Well, yes, and I think the answer is yes and then some, because we know during this period of time, we start to, the frontal cortex starts to grow, which means the thing that's most consistent in a child's brain around age, right when this puberty starting, around 10 or 11, is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the fight or flight center. That's where we're, you know, gut reaction and fear-based and sort of impulsive. That's what starts to generate more of the decision-making process as kids step into this age. The frontal cortex, the frontal lobe, that's where short-term memory, the ability to learn from past experiences and past mistakes. But that's going through one of its major growth spurts. It's unpredictable. It's unreliable. So already their brain, to some degree, is not working for them. But then when we add some of the technological kind of quirks, as well as instant gratification and the ability to be able just to kind of check things over and over and over again, so you don't necessarily develop this ability to recall and remember, I think a lot of those things are all working in tandem. Now, we know our kids cannot be devoid of a technologically savvy environment. So it's really about good sharing. It's really about having conversations with them on how to appropriately use it. And not just, do this, don't do that, but the why, and being able to kind of think through what will be the fallout, what will be the consequences, in addition to certain things that are acceptable and appropriate, and those things that are not acceptable or appropriate. Now, anytime I work with people that have technology problems, this is, you know, I expect kids to act like kids. I expect teenagers to act like teenagers. I expect parents and adults to act like adults. And so one of the things is whenever we're trying to implement a different model or approach, is as parents, we have to kind of check ourselves and say, what is our relationship to technology? What is our relationship? If we go out to eat, is everybody checking their cell phone? Are they texting? We model what we expect of our kids. And that's very important because once they start moving into those teenage years, they remember all of our faults and inconsistencies. They tend to call it our hypocrisy. I like to call it our inconsistencies. But again, moving forward to this generation we are seeing, whether it be through technology, whether it be reality TV, whether it be through self-promotion, this generation is kind of in a narcissistic epidemic. Narcissistic traits and rates are at a 50-year high. Every college student that enters their freshman year, they're kind of given sort of this survey where we start to identify some of their traits and values. And this generation thinks they're better leaders than the previous generation. They think that, you know, they just have more leadership or confidence. And so what we're seeing is things like empathy. It's, you know, things that we normally kind of counterbalance those narcissistic and self-absorbed characteristics. They're kind of lacking in this generation. And part of it has been even certain things like empathy or serving others. Now there's an ulterior motive attached to this. It's to be able to get into college, or it's to be able to pad your resume, rather than it's for its own sake, that it's a very admirable and quality characteristic. But again, we also see this for another reason. We have moved into this generation where it is the age of anxiety and fear, even in parenting. So there's this hyper-vigilant sort of model of parenting, and they've talked a lot about it with helicopter parenting. Now, you probably see that in the news a lot, but where because of 24-hour social media, because everybody has access to some type of news feed and what's going on in the world, and because the media or social media is very quick to find something very sensationalistic and loop it into a 24-hour cycle, there is this perception that the world is more dangerous, especially for our kids. When the reality is, it's actually the opposite. Crime rate is at an all-time low. Violence as teenagers is at an all-time low. Drinking and drug use trends in terms of binge and excessive are steadily declining. Bullying is at an all-time low. We're seeing all of these trends that indicates that actually it's a pretty safe time to grow up as a kid. And yet what we're seeing from parents, though, is that some of the things that we used to be able to do, kind of walk to school or ride your bike in the neighborhood, we're seeing this message that it's more scary times, and we're preventing kids from developing some of those skills and experiences till a later point. And last year we hit all types of news feeds where parents were getting arrested because they let their kids walk home from the park by themselves. Things of that nature. My wife and I are always having this kind of constant conversation back and forth of, would we let our kids walk to school? You know, even if it was other kids, and even if they had to cross a major street. But we know that it's actually safer now for them to do that than it was for us growing up, and we did it. My wife and I both did that, and yet there's this culture that's kind of created this sort of fear-based parenting. There's also this kind of age of anxiety and fear that they have to do a lot if they're going to get into college because things are uber competitive. And I already talked a little bit about that's actually not the case. There's a higher percentage of kids going into college than ever before. So we tend to overestimate the risks, and what we tend to do is mistakes now seem to have this higher kind of consequence, to where parents more so than ever in this generation are shielding or protecting or preventing kids from a lot of times making mistakes, struggling, or, dare I say, fail. And so now again we start to understand why we're having this, like, launching into adulthood later, why we're having some narcissistic traits kind of shoot up the roof, because in a lot of ways we are now in an era of child-centric family. The children are actually at the center of the family. Where do they want to go vacation? Where do they want to eat tonight? What do they want to do? Rather than creating what we can say is a more reality-based formula, which is you are a part of the family, you don't run the family, and even in society and culture, a child or a teenager does not have as much authority, independence, or autonomy as a fully fledged adult. So we're creating a very unrealistic model that a lot of times, my failure to launch guys, they crash and burn when they get what they think they want, which is full independence and autonomy, but they're not really prepared to do that because they haven't been having to make those daily decisions about lifestyle or things of that nature. It's amazing. They talk about in college, there are still a lot of kids that their parents call the college administration, and they're talking with advisors and things of that nature, or parents still kind of calling or texting to remind them to get up for class and not sleep in, things of that nature. My first semester of college, I talked to my mom twice. People, yeah, well, and she liked it. But think about it now where parents want to know what they're doing, when they're leaving, when they get there, when they're getting back, and if they're 5 minutes late, where are you, why are you getting? And so we've created sort of this, it's a domino effect where now we're all kind of serving this model that really makes hyper-vigilant, hyper-aware, hyper-involved, and what it's also doing is creating a stress bubble. So for the first time, teenagers are reporting higher levels of stress than adults are. Even though a lot of times stress is, a lot of times it's perception, how I view things that are going on. But if we're not allowed to make mistakes, and if things are very threatening or dangerous, and there's all this pressure to get into college and to do well, we're seeing, and then as well as adolescence and puberty is starting earlier, we're seeing a lot of our kids are not really well equipped to handle that level of stress. Now again, it's self-reported, like how stressed are you, how would you describe your life? But this generation of teenagers report a number level of stress and anxiety that's equivalent to an adult psychiatric patient in the 1950s. So that's in terms of the lifestyle and their perception of the world that they're living in.
Who's causing that?
Well, if it was a single cause, we would have a single remedy. What we're seeing, just whether it be about social, relational, academic, parenting, we're seeing a sweeping where a little bit of everything is contributing to that. And so we have what's called the adolescent anxiety trap. On the one hand, they want independence and autonomy, they want freedom, but they're fearful, everybody, of making mistakes. And then a lot of times there's these blurred lines of when mistakes start to happen, like who's responsible, who's accountable? Am I a failure as a parent because I shouldn't have let them kind of do that at the beginning? Or does the kid recognize, like, I made a poor choice, or I'm not yet ready for that, and they start to generate more self-directing, corrective behavior? So one of the things when we talk about this generation is we don't parent out of fear, right? The very first thing I highlighted is most kids turn out fine. It's uneven. Every one of our kids has strengths. They have some weaknesses and drawbacks and some things that are going to develop later on, and some we're going to realize when they're in their 20s, like, oh, you forgot to get in line for that trait or characteristic, and that's going to be something that they're going to have to manage most of their life. But part of that natural process is to step back, and this is the safest time in their lives for them to make mistakes because the stakes are low. And you are there. And you have the ability to catch it early on and help a minor mistake stay a minor mistake. Or if it is, help step in and intervene and provide resources and support so it doesn't become a major mistake. Because we recognize this idea of resiliency is most of us actually learn and grow and mature more through our mistakes and shortcomings than just from our successes. And especially in a generation that's struggling with self-absorption and narcissism, they need that ability to counter that, to learn from their mistakes, rather than it starts to really shatter their already unrealistic sense of self And that's when we talk about people start to overcompensate because they have such an overinflated yet sensitive and fragile sense of what they're able to accomplish. Yes, adolescence is tumultuous for everybody, but it's really about this opportunity where we get to start seeing our kids moving to these next stages of adolescence, of teenage and young adulthood, whether it be relationally as family, whether it be socially with their peers, whether it be academics, as well as all those other facets of their life that often make life very enriching and meaningful. Because, quite honestly, very few teenagers would say, I find academics meaningful. But usually it's this idea that it opens doors and opportunities for what they will find meaningful and purposeful in their life. So the framework, and this is pretty universal, this has always been the case, we've known this for generations and generations, is kids tend to flourish when there's high expectations. That there's something we continuously aspire to, right? Because if teenage and developmental is about growing, it's about taking those next steps, the model has to be the same thing as well. We don't settle, or we don't have this kind of expectation that doesn't continue to rise as well. Because there's nothing more frustrating as a parent when you have a 15-year-old and they still act like an 8-year-old. So we keep having high expectations as they go through, even though, and here's the key thing, our expectations are stage appropriate, not age appropriate. Because if you have a 15-year-old that acts like an 11-year-old, you're setting them up for failure if your expectation is for them to make a jump to a 16-year-old. No, if they act like an 11 or emotionally they're very immature, then the next expectation is to get them to that 12-year-old phase of wherever that may be. And that's one of those parenting to everybody's unique needs. High expectations, but high esteem. This belief that not that they alone, but we as a community, we as in everybody that's a part of their life, you can meet these expectations. There is either already in you the capabilities and skill sets, or there are people and resources available to develop some of those traits that you can reach that next level of growth and maturity. But here's the one thing that we know, is that nobody is perfect, right? Nobody's perfect. Parents aren't perfect, our kids aren't perfect. So the third thing, which really is an unspoken thing, but I generally added into these three pieces of the framework, is there has to be the capacity of self-compassion. That I'm not perfect. That if I get a bad grade, or I mess up in a relationship or a friend, or I send a stupid text, or I have a really explosive fight with my parents or a sibling, that we all make mistakes. Now again, we're going to create that mindset of how do we learn from them, but we don't go down hard, because sometimes when we have such high expectations and we don't meet them, it's very common for everybody to come down hard, because we believe, again, that the stakes are so high and they have such dramatic and intense implications. Now, having said that, I'm much more of a proponent of we do character development, and usually that's preaching to the choir, pun intended, when I speak at kind of faith-based organizations or schools, because there's already this built-in understanding and belief of that. And so when we think about that, we want to develop a moral code. What's right or wrong, what's good or bad. Because we know that that plays a huge implication later in life. And the reason for that is, if we have a moral code, if we have a value system, a lot of times that will help our teenagers when they're presented with this everyday occurrence. What I need to do, what I want to do. And what I want to do is the bedrock of what we call emotional reasoning. I only do something when I feel like it. If I feel like studying, I study. If I feel like taking a nap, I take a nap. If I feel like binging on Netflix, I binge on Netflix. And so we want to replace that and challenge it with actually more of a value, because then when we have to do those hard things in life, the things that I can think of a million things I'd rather do, there's at least one piece that helps us with our confidence and our esteem. But it's worth it because it aligns with my values. When I tend to work with kind of identity and purpose issues, a lot of times there's a couple main struggles that people find themselves when they feel kind of lost and unanchored in their life. One is either they don't really feel like they have that idea of a moral code or a purpose. Like they're floating aimlessly. Or the other is, there's this huge dichotomy and gap between what they value and believe and how they're actually living their life in terms of behaviors and actions. And so we want to create that connection and that bridge between the two. And so to have a truly happy life, you need to have a moral code. So especially with young kids, we value character over cool. When I work with my groups, we always kind of say, what do you want to be known for? You know, what are those values or morals or principles you want to be known for? Because then we say, well, you need to identify those, because if you don't have them in your head, how will you know if you've lived by your values this week? So one of the things, I'm doing 2 groups right now, one for high school guys, one for kind of college and young adult guys, and they've identified their values. And then each week we say, well, what's something this week that happened that advanced your values? So for one, it's honesty for one guy. So he'll say, like, how have I been honest, either with my parents or with myself? Because that's when we start to feel better about the direction that our life and that we're building something, versus if life, from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep, feels like it's occupied by academics and pressure and stress, it starts to be very difficult to motivate them to stay in that, because a lot of kids struggle emotionally during this period of, like, what's the purpose? What's the point? So we want to instill values to be the first foundation in terms of raising this generation of kids. They also need to have a purpose. The idea that school, math, science, and those are personal examples of my own, that they lead to something bigger and better and greater than what they experience in the classroom. So there has to be this idea of a here and now and down the road. Otherwise, kids have very big difficulty developing intrinsic motivation. Because we all tend to be more motivated by things that, that either interest us or gives us something at the end. We're just kind of wired in that way. If a kid from preschool or kindergarten up till 12th grade, they're involved in academics that they hate, and they feel like it's so stressful and it's nonstop and 3 or 4 hours of homework every night, there needs to be this idea of purpose, even in their academics, or recognizing where academics plays in the larger or smaller scheme of life. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But having a purpose gives them direction, gives them a sense of themselves. That if life is more than academics, well, then you have to have something identified that's more than academics. And if academics, here's the challenge for purpose. If academics, if getting good grades in middle school is to get into good programs or IB or things like that in high school, which is a launching point to get into a good college, which then is the launching point to get into a good career in socioeconomic, we've already talked about the frontal lobe of a teenager is not working in their favor. If you put all of the payoff years and years and years down the road, that doesn't create motivation. So there needs to be something about even today in life, what is my purpose? What's the payoff? What's the value? What's the benefit? Otherwise, kids will say, well, it's not worth it. All of this, and I don't get the payoff for 10, 12, 15 years, especially if we know that you can go to college, you can do everything right, you can get a 4-year degree, and then still not get a job that you're able to support yourself. So we have to be able to find that now. We know that the #1 predictor of a happy life is love. I mean, the Beatles had it right. In some ways, all you need is love. But we know it's twofold. It's the recognition that others love you, and then your ability to reconnect with them in ways that are loving to the other people. Because we are wired to be in connection with one another. That's probably the biggest challenge of technology we're seeing that differentiates how it's really ailing males versus females. So females, you have sort of the social media and the texting. Teen girls, by the way, average 100 texts a day. Boys only average about 60 or 50. But we know that girls, even if they have technology problems, it's more about this fear of missing out, that they're kind of hyper-vigilant and checking statuses and how many likes and who who hearted their Instagram photo, but they still remain connected. Guys, we're seeing this more through gaming, which isolates them. They retreat from more of the social and interpersonal opportunities, and they hole up in their rooms or in their basements. And then they're spending 8, 10 hours a day playing video games. And we know that's a huge epidemic for guys right now, and it's one of the new main kind of characteristics of male depression. It's that they start checking out of life and they start numbing or going into it's like a fantasy world through gaming. So connecting with people is important because that's also how we start to develop an emotional vocabulary and the ability to express and read other people. One of the things that's pretty prominent right now in the media is this idea of emotional intelligence, and they're talking about the value of that over IQ, like actual cognitive intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the ability to read other people's emotions, verbal and nonverbal cues, and be able to then respond in a way that connects people together rather than we either miss it or dismiss it or invalidate it. Did you have a?
Well, they say that kids that are in gaming become better doctors. So it's like at 360. So
Yeah.
Are or not.
they become better, like better surgeons. Kids
Kids
that
who are gaming.
who are gaming. And they did a study, and they said that kids that are into gaming become better doctors than kids that are not into gaming.
Yeah, and there are kids and there are people that gaming and that problem solving and that hyper focus, it actually helps them in terms of rewiring and concentration. But we also know that it also tends to recircuit a lot of other kids as well, and it creates inefficiency, the myth of multitasking, and we also know that it can create, for guys especially, a very depressive kind of coping strategy, especially if they don't have resiliency, that ability to bounce back from hardship and mistakes in life. They tend to kind of give up and they start gaming. So we know that both sides of the coin is true for you all with your kids. Parenting unique to each one of them, you have to ask yourself, what does my kid present like in terms of their emotional vocabulary, as well as their sensitivity to setbacks and challenges, and how do they engage in their technology? Is it something that's complementary in one of many ways they connect with people, or is it becoming the primary way they connect with people, or is it how they check out when life starts to get difficult or tough?
So Jonathan, is emotional IQ such a hot button topic now because we're seeing it diminish due to technology and the inability of people to...
I think in some ways, I mean, you know, we have a brand in our practice that's really about performance psychology. And they're really going into businesses and just talking about how do you train and retain this young generation of adults going into the workforce and the market force that in a lot of ways, they're very raw, they're very green. One of the things we talked about in terms of this emerging adult, delayed adulthood is the number and percentage has gone down of teenagers that have part-time or summer jobs. So they're lacking some of these everyday life skills, even in a professional work paid environment, let alone even when they're at home. Like, my mom showed me how to use the washer and dryer when I was 10. She said, "Do you know how to use it?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, I'm never doing your laundry again." And she never did. And then later on, she showed me how to iron, and she said, "Now I'm never ironing your clothes again." And she didn't. And as soon as I told my wife, like, I iron and do clothes, she's like, "Marry me," you know? And it's like, but part of that is not just that. It's not just the gaming, but we're seeing also this hyper academic, hyper anxious, intense. So even when we grew up and went to school, there was a much larger premium or emphasis on social interaction. Group dynamics. Now it's really about testing and the accumulation of information and being able to regurgitate it. And we kind of, in some ways, and it's nobody's fault. If there was a simple problem, there'd be a simple solution and we would correct it. But we're seeing that this has sort of shifted the dynamic that our kids are growing up in, and we as parents are having to be mindful and monitor. But we know to have a truly happy life, they need to know how to love, because when things go down, we have to believe that there are people on our side. So, let's talk a little bit about this how do we start helping them? And one of the things that we start to challenge this, they're hitting puberty earlier, but they're launching in adulthood later, is we are always continuously stretching the envelope. We allow them to take on more of what they can do for themselves, or what we think they might be able to do for themselves. Why? Because again, this is the safest time for them to stumble and to awkwardly kind of figure out how to be more responsible, how to take on some everyday tasks and skills for themselves. Usually if I have a 16, 17, or 18-year-old come in with their parents, the first thing I say is, you don't wake them up. There's an alarm. The alarm doesn't work by their bed, you go put it on their dresser. They have to get up, they get out of bed. No, don't let it be their phone, because it's their phone's in the room, and chances are they were up late doing other stuff with their phone. It's also, if it's their phone, the next time somebody likes something and they get an alert, they wake up and now their sleep has been interrupted. Because at some point, are you guys going to wake them up when they go to college? Like, that just seems like a very basic way that you can help them learn to sink or swim. And if they get demerits and they have to stay after school, then they have to stay after school. And if it compromises their ability to be involved in some of their sports and other organizations, then it is. Because we have to start developing within them this ability of an internal locus of control, which means my choices influence my life. And when we rescue or we shield from the consequences, what it communicates is, no, when I mess up, somebody else is going to clean it up for me. And that is not a reality-based living. Now, again, we stretch it, so it's always to the next stage. So what this looks like for a 12 or 13-year-old is going to look vastly different than a 17 or 18-year-old. It's because we want them to start shifting towards self-direction. We want them to, we start to be more consultants and sort of kind of sideline observers and monitors without directing them in terms of what they need to do or what they need not to do. It's better to figure that out now, as well as there's a lot of resources and opportunities to help if our kids start to struggle. Because what we're seeing is when parents are over-vigilant and they're the ones that are reminding and nagging and constantly pushing kids to perform things, we're seeing, once they leave the home, their life goes into shambles. Right now, a normal 18-year-old doesn't have any kind of unique brain wiring, doesn't have really any emotional challenges or problems, and no history of like substance or addictive problems. A normal kid going into college has a 1 in 6 chance of failing before the end of the first semester. If they have ADHD, it's a coin toss. They have a 50-50 chance of flaming out before the end of the first semester. This is October. Guess how many people I started seeing because their first reports went back and they haven't gone to class. Or they spent 170 hours the first month playing video games. But if, as parents, the only way they get up, the only way they do their homework, the only way they eat, the only way they go outside, the only way they do these things is the parents pushing them, what do you expect when you give them too much freedom and they don't have the skills to self-direct themselves? So a lot of times, this idea, we start to create these negotiables and non-negotiables. What's the most important? Again, for character and for morals and for emotions rather than purely academic, because the negotiables always has to be longer. The non-negotiables are basically this. When you don't abide by these, we have a problem. And life gets a little less great for you. And that's where we exert our parenting authority. The negotiables are, this is what I'd like, this is what I think would make life better for you, but this is where you get to kind of figure out who you are as an independent person. And there's no right or wrong. You guys have to decide that. Like for us, keeping your room clean is a negotiable. There's no consequence. Now, there's always a line to where, well, if you want to go with a friend, so they kind of know, like, it'll eventually get clean, but I have a choice of doing it a little at a time, or the hour before I want to go to a friend's house, and then if I can't do it in an hour, I get less time with my friends. Academics is right there on the line. It's more of if there's a certain grade, then you're probably going to start going into tutoring early in the morning until it gets back up to that acceptable line. But if it's above that acceptable line, and if the acceptable line is a B, and they have a B+, we're not pushing them to get an A. There's other things that are non-negotiable for us. They have to be involved in some type of athletics because they need exercise, and I want them to learn how to interact and respect with adult authority in a lot of ways, sometimes being a little bit hard on them. But we also want them to learn teamwork and the ability to work together in a lot of ways they don't get in the classroom automatically. We also, non-negotiable is something artistic. They have to be involved either in music or dance or drama because we want them to learn other ways to express themselves rather than simply the ability to talk. Those for us are non-negotiables. That's our family legacy. They have good enough genes that they want to go to college, they'll be able to go to college. And we set what's not acceptable more than what they have to achieve. And then when they meet short with the negotiables, that's where we as parents get that bite our lip, like, oh, I wish she was more kind of self-motivating, or, you know, I wish she chose better friends, or whatever it may be. Love and respect and honesty is priority number one, not academics. And so a lot of parents get into this trap where we incentivize academics and then they basically turn a blind eye to some of these other things that are really going to set your kids back. I see this a lot primarily with like drinking and drug issues, like, but they're getting good grades and it's not developed yet into like an actual legal problem or things along those lines. So I usually say, oh, but so when their grades start failing, then their marijuana is a problem. You know, you start to send these mixed messages about it where it's like, well, actually, you see, marijuana is illegal, and if they get caught with it, now it's an illegal problem. So, you know, if they get bad grades, it's not illegal. You know, they can do summer school, they can go to community college. But we have to start asking ourselves, what is the message of what's the most important priority in their life? Because as parents, kids come in and they'll tell me, all my parents care about is my grades. By the time we get into middle or high school, all we're talking about is my grades. Every conflict is generally around grades. At some point, that is the message, and if all we talk about is academics, the message is the most important thing in their life is academics. Now, I talked to you earlier about this generation are making better choices about drugs and alcohol, and that's true. However, because puberty is starting earlier, the age of first use is younger. So that's one of the concerns. And so what we know is the average age of, for those that try alcohol before they graduate high school, for boys that try it, the average age is 11. They try their first alcohol at age 11. For girls, it's 12. The average age of marijuana, if they try marijuana during high school, before high school, is age 14. And so about 20% of 8th graders have had a drink in the last 30 days, and about 15% of them have been drunk in the last year. So that's something that we really want to talk about earlier and earlier, because it used to be they'd have to go out and find it, but now, and I know this may be a different context here, but more and more schools are drug infested, and the kids know where to find it, and they do some self-reports, and in a lot of ways, high schoolers reported over 50% they could get alcohol within a day if somebody wanted. They could get prescription pain pills, they could get marijuana. They know where it's at, they know where people are using it on campus, and they know who to go to if they want to buy it.
What about, so kids are going through puberty earlier. Does that, has the age at which they're experimenting with sex gone down as well?
No, it actually has not.
Interesting.
Yeah, it has actually gone up. And so, well, again, one of those is in terms of like, that tends to have more of a stigma in terms of pregnancy or kind of lifestyle, and we know this age of anxiety, where we're seeing a lot more with drugs and alcohol, is it's become much more of a dealing with stress outlet. And those that tend to start to develop problems earlier on, it may be curiosity, availability, and fun that triggers the initial use, but those that tend to start using it on a more regular basis, it's for coping. It's not because they're having fun anymore, it's because every other aspect of life is so demanding. I don't know how to cope, so I use a very artificial coping strategy. If you guys want to know what's going on in your kid's life, you have to be available and you have to listen. And it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing model that you're available to your kids, that you encourage them to communicate and open up. And here's one of the tricky parts. The first time they say something that you don't agree with or is really worrisome, we don't jump in. We give them that space that we are a safe person you can talk about anything to.
Well, that's so hard though, because you want to be an enforcer and you want to care, but how do you, okay, well, that's great, and how do you not kill them? Like, I mean, like, seriously, you just did this, how do you not react and how do you stay calm? You see
Well,
what I'm saying?
yeah, and one of the ways we do that, and that's difficult for everyone, myself included, is not every conversation has to have a beginning point and end point resolution. That's why we make ourselves available. Even if it's an hour later, we follow up. Even if it's the next day, can we talk about this again? Because I wanted to let you just open up to me, but now we need to talk about some of the things you said that are really concerning as a
Do you wait
parent.
a day to do that?
You can wait it. I mean, there's no necessarily hard formula, but one of the ways to make it safe is the second they say something, we don't cut them off, and we go into parenting mode or enforcer mode. Because you want to develop this ongoing relationship that mom and dad are safe. They won't always agree, and I know that, but, and this is what I work with teenagers, if something's concerning, it's better to be proactive and then deal with the fallout or consequences that versus when we cover up and we get caught, and then it's also then not only did you do that, but you tried to cover it up and you only admitted about it when the evidence was stacked up against you. And usually as parents, we tend to punish or discipline them in a different way with that. Let me quickly wrap this up because I don't want to hold you guys any longer than you have to go. If, again, this idea of like hyper anxious, hyper fearful, any pushback, right? We expect pushback. Not every disagreement is a conflict. They're starting to believe and see things differently as their parents. We want that. We don't always get to choose those areas that they do that, but we want them to start having some independent thinking of their own, because if they live their life for you, they will start to resent you if it's not for them. And we do not want them resenting you because you are their #1 supporter, cheerleader, support system. So it can't be me versus my parents. It has to be me and my parents in this path and direction of life. As they get older, as we step back from parents, and this is why I have a job, we step back as parents, but we invite other adults and role models to be a part of their life. And we don't take that personally. We recognize that's just the automatic thing that has to happen. So again, right? We let them take good risks. We let them make mistakes. We anticipate they're going to explore and test limits, become autonomous, discover a sense of self. That's what we want. Is it easy? No, it's not easy as parents, but guess what? It's not easy for them either. But that's one of the ways that we start to hopefully develop this time frame and model of what they're going through developmentally, what this generation in terms of culture and society is implementing or pressing upon them, and how do we both preemptively and in a responsive way parent that helps them hopefully be successful and navigate through it to where it's uneven, it's unpredictable, we're going to see where our kids struggle, but the majority of them are going to come out of it normal, healthy, happy, with an idea of what they want in life and where they fit. So basically that's it. So I know for those of you that maybe need to go, I've run a few minutes over. I certainly want to be respectful of your time, but I'm also I'm willing to stick around for a few minutes to answer any follow-up questions and things of that nature. Yes?
I'm struggling going back to where you were saying it's actually safer now. I mean, my mind is stuck on that. I am definitely highly anxious and highly fearful about the world that we're launching our kids in currently. If you could speak a little bit more to that of how it's actually safer. You know, my point of reference obviously is the news and things and shootings in schools.
Sure.
And, you know, these kind of things.
Yeah, and I would say that last year was the first anomaly of shootings after basically since Columbine where we didn't see a decrease in shootings. So last year was an anomaly, but here's the reality in terms of child abduction, in terms of violence against teenagers, as well as teenage violence against teenage violence. Those have been going down steadily for up to 20 years. But when we were growing up, both the good and the bad wasn't on this constant cycle. So we focused primarily on what was happening on our street, what was happening in our neighborhood, what was happening in our community. And so it was more through anecdotal, my neighbors and my friends and family, what's going on, what's happening in our neighborhoods. But now we hear something that happens in 4 or 5 states away, and it immediately says that could have been us. And the reality is it could have been. But it wasn't, statistically speaking. Your kid is more likely to die from a cow falling on top of them than certain things like a shark attack. They're more likely to die from a television falling on them than from a terrorist attack or a school shooting. But because of the loop, it highlights these small percentage numbers that they are actually very real threats. Now, having said that, part of the reason they stay low-level threats is, as schools, as communities, we respond even when something is a small threat of how do we step back and say, what do we need to be doing as a community, as a school, as a church, whatever that may be, to make sure we are addressing and not just blindly saying this would never happen to us. But from a statistical standpoint, it's safer. We just don't get that message from the media because that's not really sensational. That's not like, oh, things are better for your kids right now, versus another school shooting, or kids are doing hard drugs, or whatever that may be. And then it gets picked up and it's cycled, and then you hear it on the news, but then you read it on Facebook, and then somebody sends you a link, and all of a sudden it's like, well, that must be it, because it's created this sea, this storm and wave. Does that mean we turn a blind eye? No, but we are proactive parents, and if we parent out of fear, we are going to contribute to our kids living a life that's more motivated by fear, stress, and tension. Rather than, as parents, our job is to make as much of a safe and supportive environment for you to thrive as well as to make mistakes. You know, we do a lot of groups and individual work where it's really about helping anxious parents, because they recognize, like, I read this and all of a sudden my adrenaline goes up to a 9 when I realize that's me. That's not the world that we live in. And it's a struggle. You know, the reason they came up with helicopter parenting and overprotective is because we're not the only ones. You're not the only one. We all, this is maybe the most important facet of our life. What other questions, comments, complaints? Yeah?
How much time might you recommend on average between shutting down your computers before kids should be getting off to bed?
The rule of thumb is as close to an hour as possible. You know, we also know that there's a difference between, and I'm not endorsing this so much as saying, there's a difference between watching a television that's 10 or 12 feet away, that has a lot of space and other colors to mute the optical stimulation, than a tablet or a phone that's right here. But generally, we recommend a good hour of a buffer between. And so, but again, in order for that to happen, we have to start to reorganize priorities of how we manage our time. And for our kids, there's a bedtime, and if you haven't finished, either get up earlier or you go to tutoring earlier in the morning. But there's also buffers. We have a technology curfew, and they turn it in, and it's a place where we can see it. And they didn't like it because, especially if we are changing the status quo, and the status quo works for your kids, what will you expect? Resistance, right? You can expect that. But if it's what is best for them, that's why we are parents. That's when we don't want it, but we accept, you're not going to like this, we're probably going to fight about it, but if this is a non-negotiable, and you get to decide if that is, if it's a non-negotiable, I'm willing to fight over the non-negotiables. The negotiables, like clean room, not so much. Like picking up your, you know, doing your laundry without me reminding you to take it to the laundry room, that's a negotiable, but that's what we generally recommend. I'm sorry, I didn't see
Okay, I just want to say 2 things I want to share. There's a really good book that my husband and I both read. It's called Generation IY, and it's about this generation. I don't know if you've read it or not.
Most of it, yeah.
And it's a good book, and it kind of talks about, you know, some of the instant gratification things, and then the consequence when they're in college and in their 20s. Really good book. And then with relation to technology and sleep, a very good friend of mine who's a sleep specialist up in New Jersey just did a study with 3,000 high school kids. And if he allows me, I can send you the link to his little 2-minute thing and his study, and if you guys want to do. I'll check with him first, but interesting study about how the technology affects Generation I, Y.
The other thing that we generally recommend is you don't use technology in bed because you send mixed messages, because the body, we're wired to be conditioned. And so if we're in the kitchen, our brain actually anticipates we're going to eat or there are things available. When we're wired, like if we anticipate we're going to the beach or the mountains and that's relaxing, our brain is actually helping set up that to be a relaxing environment. If our bed is designed to be the place where we rest and yet we use technology, that we start to send mixed messages. So even when we unplug, we're in an environment where, no, that's where I game, that's where I text, that's where I get really ticked off at my friends when they don't text me back right away, or if my friend didn't, heart that Instagram photo. And so we really recommend you keep the bed, especially since we're hitting a sleep epidemic, because we're having a stressful age of anxiety. We need to preserve the conditioning for that, to where whether it's a chair in their room or at their desk or out in kind of the loft or whatever area, but a lot of times it's me stepping back and saying, but what's making it harder? It's not the problem, it's not the solution, but what's making things harder? What could help? Because if there was a simple problem and a simple solution, we would do it. And we would get the turnaround. But it's a number of variables at play that creates a complex problem. I know you have to think about it.
Well, see, it's harder as they get older, and they always have a valid argument. And you never have that great comeback line.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard because they say, well, I'm doing good at school, I'm doing everything you're asking of me, yet you want my phone at the end of the night, but it's not affecting my grade, and I get off on time, I'm doing everything you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have this rule that you turn it in at a certain time, but then they do everything you're asking and expecting,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
you want them to, you say, well, here's a give or take, I'm becoming a young adult, I'm showing you I'm being responsible, so why do you still want to take it away from me?
Well, and you have to make that judgment call, whether you make that a negotiable or non-negotiable, especially if the child is demonstrating positive choices and everything in other areas. But here's what I would say. If you choose to go down this route, my parenting is not conditional. If you do everything right, there are still rules that govern this family that everybody has to fall under. I don't, because I do everything right, get to just to decide how I parent or not parent, or what type of spouse or what type of employee. There are some natural consequences, but even then, there are certain guidelines that guide our lives. And one of them is, you're my son or you're my daughter, you will respect, you will listen to me, and if we have a problem with that, well, that's when we'll probably go meet with somebody like me, to where we say that this child has created a sense of entitlement, that if they do certain things, they automatically assume they have a God-given right for this. And that's not how the real world works. And that's not how purposeful parenting works. Because everybody in this world has certain guidelines and values and morals and laws that we follow. Not because we get something, it's because if we don't, there is a consequence. See, and that's how we sometimes de-incentivize. By doing the right thing, we get something more. No, it's part of life is when we don't do something, we get something less.
And it's their job to keep testing us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really easy to get kind of beaten down by that, but part of our job is also to maintain our credibility by showing that test and test and test. That absolute is still an absolute. We have a docking station, that's where I dock, you dock, everybody docks. If you got a B, that's awesome. Let's keep on that track. That doesn't mean that's not the docking station. You know, it's a slippery slope. It's hard to keep the absolutes absolute. But you lose credibility, and the message then to them is, well, if I ask 13 more times, you're saying there's a maybe. And then we're toast.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So is it consistency? A little bit different way. You talk about the age of puberty coming down. When's the right or appropriate age to start talking to your son or daughter about sex and so forth?
Probably 4th or 5th grade. You know, because basically we can be proactive and responsive. And again, it's not necessarily talking about everything, but it's starting a dialogue and starting to say, And because I am a therapist, my wife, and I have 2 daughters, she's like, you get to go do the drugs and alcohol and the sex talk. And my daughter's like, is Daddy gonna go do that? But it was much more about what have you heard, what do you guys as friends talk about, you know, what, and then just talking through some scenarios, like if this were to happen, like who would you tell or how would you feel? It's not always, again, and this kind of parenting is we assume it's all about giving information. And a lot of times it's not about giving information, it's being available and listening. So that when we start to recognize there is some misinformation or they need information, we've helped kind of create as much of a discomforting, you know, as much as a comfortable scenario is able to, so that then we can talk about certain things. But whether it be sex, whether it be drugs and alcohol, whether it be dating and other stuff like that, whether it be other stuff that you might find to be hot topic, you know, issues, it's really about laying the framework so that when things are going on in their life, or you hear about things, we can say, you know, what have you been hearing? What do the kids on the bus talk about? You know, I mean, I have a guy I'm working with. It's unfortunate he was involved in a Christian outreach called Young Life, but his Young Life Club, guess what? That's where he got introduced to marijuana, because most of the guys going there were smoking marijuana. And it's kind of like, well, if we start having those conversations of like, well, why do you like to go to these things? And who's there? And how much do they talk or not talk about these types of things? And parenting is exhausting. But if we're going to be exhausted, let's be very purposeful parents rather than reactive parents that will be exhaustive, but we still don't know, is it all coalescing into a cohesive strategy and framework for them? And that's when we're kind of like blindfolded and shooting a shotgun in the hope that we hit the target. That's really exhausting. Like purposeful parenting, positive parenting, that's hard enough. It really is. Any other questions?
You feel as a parent, and your mental illness, you know, like he has, well, you think it's never a perfect situation. It's
No.
different for everyone, you know?
But here's,
You said everything right, everything the way I was brought up, you know, having rules, having regulations, and then they turn out different, and you're like, where did I go wrong?
well, and that's an epidemic of this generation, this fear that we will fail as parents. We are going to make mistakes. 99.9%, there's still that really small percent, 99.9% of the families I work with, I tell them this: you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. It's not about trying harder, it's about trying different once we have more information or awareness. But that whole mindset of like, I failed them, expects us to be perfect, and it reinforces that either entitlement or child-centered culture that we live in. And we know that's not working for anybody. It doesn't work for the parents, it's not working for our kids. They are not healthier, they are not happier, they are not more successful when they believe the world revolves around them. And guess what? Even if we take a very purposeful and proactive approach, because of what their brain is doing, they're already going to have self-absorption. Because that's the brain, that's not necessarily their character value, but then when you add a community and a culture that says, you're right, it is all about you, then we've created little mini monsters. Yeah?
And it's okay to tell them you're not their friend.
Absolutely.
I thought my son was just like, you're not my friend, Mama. You're right, I'm not your friend, I'm your mother. And someday I'll be your friend. But right now, here's my job, and having them know what your job is and what their job is, I think sometimes that helps them because they think it's all about renegotiation. Like all this redirection that you're taught now, you get little 2 and 3-year-olds. By the time they're 6, you have a lawyer that's giving you the back, you know, the back talk about, well, this is what I've done and this is how I want this to happen. It's like, well, it's still my house. When you have a house, you can do what you want. But right now, I'm here to teach you right from wrong. And what you do with it is up to you. But this is what my job is. It's okay to tell them that, but what your responsibilities are as parents.
It is, as long as that's not our way of shutting down open communication. So a lot of times, I'll give my daughters a window that we'll talk, and they'll listen to why they disagree or why I think I'm being unreasonable. and I will do my best to kind of communicate a lot of times why, but then there's a certain point where we're going to just disagree, but guess, I mean, I'm thinking this, but I'll say it, but guess who wins when we can't come to an agreement? But we want to, right? We want our kids to be able to open up with us. And so part of that is we have to, as parents, accept when they don't like what we're doing, when they disagree, hearing things that make us kind of uncomfortable and pull us out of this fantasy or reality that our kids are protected, or they don't think about that, or they're not tempted by that, or their friends are not involved in that. Because the best way we can parent our kids is to know what their reality and what their actual lives are you know, involved in, and what they're exposed to. Did you have a question, sir?
Yes. I can't recall the specifics, but there was one time where I made the wrong decision. My older daughter called me on it, and I thought about it, and she was right. And I told her I thought about it, and you are right, and I was wrong, and I backtracked.
And
Is that okay?
that's awesome.
Okay, because someone else told me, no, you made the decision as a parent, you got to stand your ground. And I thought, no, maybe I shouldn't do that.
No, because when we make mistakes, yeah, because, especially with autonomy, eventually, not eventually, our kids are always influencing us. And it's okay for them to recognize it. You influence me. I get stressed about you. I get really happy and hopeful about you. I dream for you. I worry about you. One of the things I work with fathers and sons is when you make a mistake, fathers say you're what? Sorry. Because if we create this, I have to be perfect, and they know you're not perfect. But if we hold fast to that, then they say, you know, my dad never admits mistakes. He's always right. I can't come to him. He never apologizes. And then in some ways, then we're modeling what they will eventually become. I've definitely held you guys longer than probably was agreed upon, but I want to make you aware of one quick thing. Next Friday at our office in the South Park area, so I know it's a little bit of a trek, but we are doing, twice a year we do a conference. It's a free conference, it's just during the morning, and we basically, from 9 to noon, we have a bunch of free talks that our clinicians give about a variety of subjects that we try to make is available to the community. Part of this, what I'm doing here, we try to give at least 200 free talks in the greater Charlotte area to schools, to churches, to communities. It goes everything from sleep strategies to tips managing ADHD, math homework. I'm talking about high school guys, and I'm talking a little bit more about how to avoid the failure to launch sort of set up by how we parent specifically guys in the high school. And then it talks about Asperger's or parenting skills, body image for girls. So I'm going to leave some of these here if you'd like. There's a schedule on the back, and certain times there's 3 free talks each hour. Obviously, you can only go to 1, but if you'd like to come, it's free. Space is limited. So certainly, if you show up late for the first one, you may not have option to go to any one of those 3, but we'd love for you guys to be a part of that. If you go to our website or sign up, we'll always send you free alerts of things that are going on that are free. We do weekly webinars on anything from healthy living, parenting, performance psychology, things of that nature. So, but otherwise, I can stick around for a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions, but otherwise I want to let people know you can embarrass yourself or make me feel bad if you get up and leave.
This Friday?
Next Friday, the 30th. And we'll all be dressed up, so it'll be a Halloween theme since it's the day before.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.